Salutations, respected viewers. This is my critique of Mr. Steven Crowder's video about democratic socialism, why according to him it doesn't work. So I have a lot of time for Mr. Crowder. He's a very entertaining gentleman and I share his views sometimes. So I should be open about my own, in that broadly speaking I believe in capitalism. It's dynamic and it tends to produce the best products and services. Competition is usually good for the consumer. There are times when it doesn't work, and Mr. Crowder speaks up for it too much. His blanket opposition to socialism is unsustainable. He rails against socialism on the basis that it has to take things at gunpoint. Well, capitalism takes things at gunpoint. We pay tax in capitalist societies too. Some capitalist countries have higher tax than others. The United States has got higher tax than certain other jurisdictions. And besides, Mr. Crowder loves guns. He wants guns everywhere. The more guns there are, the fewer people get shot, according to him. Why on earth would he object to people pointing guns? He thinks it's macho. And he says, anyway, that democratic socialism leads to bad outcomes. Well, sometimes it does. And he scorns democratic socialists for pointing out that Nicaragua managed to reduce illiteracy so much. You go back to the early 80s, Nicaragua had something like 20% literacy, and it's now about 100% literacy. And then he sneers at Nicaragua for having a low GDP. It does have a low GDP, which makes their achievement of full literacy all the more impressive. How much lower would that GDP be if most people couldn't read and write still? But they prioritized helping the needy, those who were poverty-stricken, who never had a chance to go to school, because they were so underpaid that they had to work from the day they could walk to sustain their family. So I think that was laudable. They taxed the rich, yeah, at gunpoint, to pay for those who were living in penury to go to school. He cited Sweden, their extensive welfare state, and said, well, it's got the highest rape rate in the world. Now, that's partly because Sweden, being the most feminist country in the world, has a very broad definition of rape, and they're very credulous of such accusations. If a woman says that she's raped by a man every day of the year, Sweden will put that down as 365 rapes. Most countries would record that as one. So that's why. It's nothing to do with the welfare state. It's not because they have a lot of paternity leave that there's a lot of rape. One doesn't lead to the other. There's no cause and effect relationship there at all. So he's cherry-picked what's the worst thing I could possibly think about Sweden, that one, and claim that it's something to do with democratic socialism. This is preposterous. We could look at, say, Colombia or El Salvador, Honduras, countries with very high murder rates, which are capitalist countries. Is that because they're capitalist? Not really. There are multifarious reasons for their high murder rate. So these are two ships passing in the night. He's not demonstrated any causal link. So Canada has a high national debt. That's true. So does the United States. Very high as well. He's claiming that's because of democratic socialism. There's some truth in that. The USA's got a very high debt. Is that because it's not democratic socialist? Well, kind of, but he's not provided a convincing argument. There are democratic socialist countries like Norway, which have a sovereign wealth fund, which has got no national debt. The country's got money in the bank. It gets richer every year of interest. Yeah, that's a bit of capitalism. So democratic socialism and capitalism don't have to be opposites. They can coexist. There are mixed economies. Every country in the world is a mixed economy, including the United States. They might lean more towards capitalism or more towards socialism, but they are mixed. So he said, the United States said no to pure democracy. It was a representative republic. Well, some of that's true. It was certainly a republic from its foundation, not very representative. Obviously, only rich white males were permitted to vote for the first few decades. Eventually, more and more whites. Eventually, very few black men, women, blah, blah, blah. I won't go into it all. But you're right, it wasn't democratic. The words democracy and democratic do not appear in the US Constitution at all, not once, even in the more recent amendments. And he's claiming that the Constitution was framed in such a way to prevent mob rule. Mob rule, well, that might be democracy, I suppose. They're the mob if he dislikes them. People vote for what's best for themselves. Yeah, they do. People do what's best for themselves. I suppose that's what capitalism is about. So why would it be wrong for the poor to say, we should have a decent share of the wealth? We should not have to be wage slaves. We don't want poverty pay. We want a minimum wage. Voting in sensible policies, social justice. He believes there's such a thing as justice. Is there such a thing as social justice? What if millions of people were starving to death in the country and some people were very wealthy? Does it behove the super rich to share a tiny fraction of their wealth with the needy to prevent them dying of hunger? I would say that it does. Wouldn't he agree? He's always saying about he's a Christian, compassionate. Jesus saying the man with 2 shirts must give one to the man who has none. Now, I think he's not against private charity, but private charity is clearly not enough. It doesn't work always to prevent this suffering. So the government's going to intervene sometimes. And I know it can go too far. I'm not a socialist either. Just a tiny bit of socialism sometimes in certain areas of life can be a good thing. Would he at least admit that? Anyway, he said the Constitution was there to prevent this demagoguery because the Founding Fathers cared about minorities, didn't want to be pushed around. Well, they cared about themselves as they were rich white males. They did not care about African Americans. They did not care about the Native Americans whom they wished to dispossess. Now, it's true there were a few abolitionists amongst the Founding Fathers, but most of them were pro-slavery. Before you say, oh, what about the British? You're a hypocrite. Yes, the British government was much the same, was run by the very affluent and didn't give a damn about the poor and treated black people appallingly. So not suggesting there's any moral high ground there. Don't draw that inference from what I said. So Mr. Crowder is wrong because some aspects of socialism sometimes work. So I'm not a socialist. I'm not speaking it up for it. And some of what he says is true. Sometimes it's disastrous. And capitalists can't confiscate things too. If you get into debt, for example, they can send the bailiffs round, confiscate stuff, just like governments can. Now, abolishing illiteracy is a good thing, and that's been done through socialist policies. Some capitalist countries have very low literacy. Well, let's say Pakistan, and about 60% of people literate there. It's not that low. Various African countries like Niger have got less than 50% literacy, and perhaps a bit more socialism would help those who never get a chance to go to school because they live in such abject poverty. Anyway, I talked about the high murder rate in various Latin American countries, often due to, well, let's say in Colombia, a civil war because communist terrorists were rebelling against the system. Why? Why was that so popular there, rebellion? Partly because capitalism was so extreme there and some people were living in terrible penury. And had a little bit been done to alleviate poverty, it wouldn't happen so much. It looks like the conflict's coming to an end, also due to the drugs trade, these narco-terrorists. Well, you can't buck the market, as I'm sure Mr. Crowder would say. Does he advocate for the legalization of drugs? I'm not sure that he does, but if he was a complete capitalist, he would say that, because they're always going to get through, and if these things were legal, there will be less harm than there is now. They're mainly selling their drugs in the United States, actually. So publicly funded healthcare can work. There are countless examples. Almost every other Western country except the United States has publicly funded healthcare. You know, the United States is in the same boat as many Middle Eastern countries. How does he like that one? Not having publicly funded healthcare. Or China in not having publicly funded healthcare. So you should be aware of the company that you keep. So there's a mixed economy in the United States as it is. I think as President Johnson recognized this. It leans more towards capitalism than many other countries. Is he against public parks, national parks, public libraries? Are those all terrible things? Those are socialist, even if he denies it. The military is socialist because it's publicly funded. Now, admittedly, there are private companies that produce the weapons. In many countries, the government produces the weapons. He's always talking up Israel, where they've got Israeli Military Industries, a semi-state company. He's scathing about public schools. Well, they're not all bad. Compare that to the time when there wasn't this, when if your family didn't have money, you didn't get to go to school. Would that be a good thing? Is he against food stamps too? Would he like to see American children malnourished? I don't think so. Private schools aren't all good, and I know I used to teach at them. Some of them are dreadful. Just because it's private, just because it's expensive, doesn't guarantee it's good, because you've got educational imperatives and business imperatives, and when they collide, the business imperative wins every single time. You lie to the parents, tell the pupils they're doing better, told, no, you can't say that in the report, you can't tell the plain truth because they won't like it. We've got to delude the parents and keep them happy because that keeps the money flowing in rather than being objective and telling the plain truth. The notion that something expensive is necessarily good is bogus. It is often better quality, but it's not always. It's a delusion. So he's against socialism because it leads to big government, it seems to me. Now, the United States has got very, very big government, mainly the military, bigger than the next 12 countries combined. Strong defense, well, the US already is strongly defended. How come Canada's not being invaded all the time? When's the last time a foreign soldier set foot in America without permission? Probably the Second World War. So this defense is overkill. Okay, he's against bureaucracy. FBI, so got the word bureau in the middle. That's bureaucratic. Why doesn't he hate that? Didn't exist till the 1920s. Perhaps he'd like to go back to a more capitalist time, like the 19th century. All right, that would be a consistent view. But I want to hear him advocating abolishing the NSA, the CIA, Homeland Security. That's all big government. That's all interfering. That's all federal. And he detests the federal government. Prisons, federal prisons or state prisons, unless they're privately owned, presumably he thinks that's dreadful. That's taxpayers' money. So slim those down hugely. I'd like to hear him advocating for that, because that's all socialism, unless they're for-profit prisons. But the courts are socialist because they're taxpayer funded. When he's not on firm ground, he starts yelling and treats things as comedy. So he says we can't trust bureaucrats because they're corrupt. Now, that's sometimes true, but it also applies to companies. Perhaps he's heard of Enron, as he lives in Texas. So they're companies that rip people off. But companies go bust. Well, they do, but it causes terrible economic ripples at the time and makes people unemployed. Think of all the waste of people being unemployed, of millions of people achieving and producing nothing, consuming wealth instead of producing it. If we had more job creation, even the government stepping in to do that, that would reduce such waste. Just talent thrown on the scrap heap. So capitalism is inefficient too. You may have heard of the Great Depression. How did the United States pull out of that? Government action. From 1936 to, for the next 30 years or so, 40 years, the United States had almost unbroken economic growth, but it was the federal government stepping in, stimulating the economy. That's what lifted the US out of the Great Depression. And really 1941, the Second World War, the United States government spending like wild, and that abolished unemployment. So capitalism can go very wrong. 2008, the world economic crash. There have been recessions. There's been unemployment. There's been overproduction. So capitalism isn't always wonderful. It does have its downside. It is wasteful, and it does lead to catastrophes sometimes. Hyperinflation, things like that. So I'm not saying capitalism is all bad. I'm mainly in favour of it. But I think he only looks at the evidence which tends to favour his case. It's confirmation bias. So companies go bust, and government saved the banks in 2008. Is he against that? Perhaps he is. Say so. That was redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich via taxpayers. That was socialism for private companies. So capitalism multiplies once. It preys on status anxiety. We hanker after status symbols. We have confections for various clothings. Read Naomi Klein's No Logo. It's about ostentation. It causes dissatisfaction, causes desires which can never be satisfied about a bigger car, showing off, I'm more macho, I'm wealthier than you, to do with clothes and houses and so on, and it can lead to wealth fatigue syndrome. There can be exploitation. This concept, this reality exists. The vicious cycle of high wages and low prices. Right now, I know this word is overused, but sometimes there really is exploitation, where people are paid poverty pay, having to do 2 or 3 jobs just to stay afloat. And a bit of government intervention could reduce that. A decent minimum wage, decent public funded services could make life much better for everybody. So huge income inequality. I'm not kept up at night with the idea there are too many billionaires in the world. It doesn't bother me. What bothers me is people living in dire poverty when they're suffering which could easily be relieved. I think we should do so. He suggests that socialism can't be democratic. Well, that's bunkum. Putting the word democratic in inverted commas. There are scores of examples of social democratic governments or socialist parties elected in democracies like Canada, the UK, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, Romania, Poland, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Jamaica, Italy, Austria, Denmark, Norway, Finland, India, Sri Lanka. I could go on all day. They're voted in, they're voted out, okay, because that's democracy. And they often have the word socialist, social democrat, or Labour in their name. I mean, they're absolutely socialist, but they believe in elements of socialism, and they believe in elements of capitalism, like a sensible person. And many people, I was a member of the UK Conservative Party, I'm a capitalist, I'm not a socialist, but I recognise sometimes a little bit of socialism is desirable. So he believes in the Constitution. The Constitution says Congress provides for the welfare. Welfare! Okay, you can't be all against welfare. Obviously the definition has broadened since then. To food stamps could be publicly funded healthcare and so on. They're publicly funded roads, that's not a bad thing. He valorises hockey players fighting. Well, that's against the law. He's speaking up for crime despite being a strict constitutionalist. Regulation to see that people do not screw others. That's what he says the Congress should do. Well then, we should have some regulations to help the poor. He wants to look at the hockey players fighting each other, contrast that with European socialists in soccer. Football, or soccer as Americans call it, is the most capitalist sport of all. Owned by private businesses, they're paid millions, there's sponsorship and all the rest of it. So no, and they don't fight very much, and that's a good thing because they're role models for children. We have the referee to sort it out. Human nature. He says that's why we should be capitalists. And I admit, because we're a bit egotistical, that's why capitalism recognises what human nature is, and socialism can be too idealistic. We're not always very sharing and caring. People can abuse that system. We sometimes need to cooperate because we face common problems, and excessive selfishness and avarice is a bad thing, and that's why we need to restrain it. Crowder, he talks about the rich. Well, they took the risk of setting up the business. They did, all right? But often it's inherited wealth. That's often generations ago. That trust fund baby, he's not taking any risk. He's got people doing wealth management for him. So it's right that we tax that at a higher rate. He's not working at all in many cases. He's just a playboy. So there is corruption even now under this capitalist system that he lauds. There are US politicians going to jail right now, members of the Trump administration, so for bribe taking and things like that, and illegal campaign donations. So don't tell me there's no corruption under the current state of affairs. Socialism, people are allowed to make their own decisions. Sometimes it's a bit more restrictive under capitalism. But if he really believes in free markets, let's have the drinking age lower in the United States, 21, about the highest in the Western world. Some Western countries, it's 18. Germany and the Netherlands, it's 16. Let's have more restrictions, fewer restrictions on things. Anyway, so I think Mr. Crowder's too doctrinaire. He's chosen his side, then he dogmatically insists that his side is absolutely right. He pretends that socialism isn't socialism just because the Constitution says the government can do this and that. It still is socialist, even though they don't specifically say it's socialist. The US Constitution doesn't say it's socialist, doesn't say it's anti-socialist, that it's capitalist, that it's anti-capitalist. You could be a socialist and completely believe in the US Constitution. So capitalism is a faith for him. I suppose because he's a religious person, he also thinks there's this text, the Constitution, I have to completely believe in that, rather than my first principle saying, is this sensible, is it not? Sometimes it is. So that's that. So a little bit of socialism is occasionally a good thing and is compatible with democracy. The USA's got government of the people, by the people, for the people, and that's why enacting socialist policies through the government is completely acceptable under a democratic system.